It's Time for Truth, a ministry of Truth Family Bible Church in Middleton, Idaho. It's Time for Truth exists to glorify God through the edification of His saints in our local church and for the benefit of the church around the world. I'm your host, Pastor Danny Steinmeier. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode of the podcast. We are glad that you have joined us once again and looking forward to this conversation today. In studio, we have once again Pastor Gabe Render, Stone Mountain Baptist Church. We have a special guest with us. He's going to stay silent apparently, but our engineer and hopefully, Lord willing, future deacon, Mark Ellison. And so looking forward to our time together. He's getting us all dialed in. We've discovered some technical issues with our setup here, so we're getting that all fixed up. And Mark gets to join the conversation, at least as an observer and with hand signals, perhaps.
Yeah, and this is obviously an impromptu deacon interview, actually, where you have to prove yourself by deaconing now.
That's right, on the spot.
Deacon up, boy, let's go.
All right. So, but no, we're always glad to have Mark close by and with us in studio. So we're looking forward to our conversation today. Really, to start off with, this is a follow-up to our last episode, wherein we talked about ordered loves. We talked about loving your own, and the idea of immigration. As obviously, it continues to be a hot topic in our day today. And so we wanted to talk a little bit more and have a follow-up. Pastor Gabe and I have spoken a little bit further about this topic and thought it would be valuable for us to come back around and discuss some of these things again and extend the topic into a few other different areas. And we'll get into that here in just a moment. To start off with, let's just pick up on maybe some of the latest news that I think will be a good launching point for us. We've got the USAID, which has been a revelation to many, really a confirmation of what so many people have already thought and believed to be the case about our government, that there are these shadow organizations, unelected people who are running things and spending our money. And people have been wondering, how in the world do we have so much spending and so much? How can our debt be so big and so forth? Where we've got billions and billions and trillions of dollars being spent, and lo and behold, as Doge and Elon Musk go after identifying where all the money is going and where are what is the government participating in. Lo and behold, we find a lot of money going to some very strange places for doing some very strange things. And then we find out also that there's a number of Christian, we'll use air quotes there, okay, Christian organizations, such as Not So Christianity Today and other organizations and so forth that are receiving USAID funding. And so maybe a place to start would be just kind of what are your initial thoughts, Gabe, on this USAID scandal, we could call it, and the revelations that are coming out, that there's so much money being spent, both internationally, of course, also domestically with various organizations and companies. What was your first thought, and how do you think of this in relationship to our previous conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think to sum it up would be the meme I saw earlier that was sort of like a small bucket of water with a little spigot on it that said something to the effect of what I thought draining the swamp would look like, and then next to it showed like a dam bursting open. It's like what it actually looks like. No, I think this is good for the American people. At the end of the day, regardless of how you may feel about Musk and the whole concept of an appointed sort of entity, right? Create a bureaucracy to end the bureaucracy. It seems like a weird tactic, but hey, for what it's worth, it seems like it's working. So, yeah, absolutely. I think there is.
Well, we seem to at least have a lot of transparency because
Yes.
they're coming out and they're telling you what they're finding and they're telling you what they're doing and where they're going. So there's something to.
Absolutely.
There's so much invitation of the media, even close to these ICE raids, the invitation of media to be close to where Trump is always talking to them and the press secretary is being very open about things. And then, of course, we're being told what Doge is doing. I think there's something valuable in that because all this
absolutely.
other stuff has been, we're not being told what's going on. All this other stuff is under the radar, behind closed doors, out of sight, out of mind, and all of a sudden, it's top of mind USAID right now because these things are being revealed and exposed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, obviously there's a lot of absurd things that we're finding money going to. A lot of it is obviously very left-wing agenda items. So your typical DEI, feminists, LGBT activists, whatever you want to call it, a lot of that money is going out. The way I look at it is when I'm reading some of these headlines, it almost feels like someone did a Mad Libs and thought, hey, we'll just do, some sort of fun for what that weird Mad Lib is. It's underwater basket weaving in Nigeria or whatever.
Well, I heard something. I heard something today that I thought was very helpful and poignant to this particular topic, and it was pointing out that this whole leftist project, this woke ideology, it isn't a grassroots from the people's own desires. It's actually one that's being forced. It's being imposed not only upon us but upon other nations.
Oh, absolutely.
That you're really seeing that this is a manufactured cultural upheaval and takeover, as opposed to what has happened in our country with the dawn of Trump 2.0. It really is, what do the people want? This is what the people clearly have wanted, and more and they're tired of how they've been treated and what they've been forced to imbibe and to fall in line with. And so now there's this element of, we're exposing the fact that this was not a natural thing. This was an imposed,
correct,
from the institutions, from this basically, it's the liberal university system and all the craziness and all the woke stuff is being financed and money being laundered through these agencies, through these NGOs, to foist upon the people and brainwash into new ways of doing things that don't just come from the people ordinarily.
Yeah, it's forcing secularism globally, right? So you take a lot of these small third world countries that are, some of them are Christian, some of them are, Buddhist, Muslim, whatever the case may be, but typically speaking, religious nations. So one of the ones that I saw that was kind of striking to me was something like to the tune of $500,000 to promote atheism in Nepal. It's like, okay, that's absurd, right? Why are we spending grant money, taxpayer money, that's supposed to be to benefit the interest? Because that's the whole point of this USAID. Like, for those that don't know, it ultimately was an executive order during the Cold War designed to essentially prop up nations that were perhaps going to be, subject to communist influence, to try to prevent that from happening as a way of actually bolstering our own well-being as a nation. And so what that's become is sort of this
national interest.
Exactly. It's national interest. And so what it's become is this humanitarian aid charity, basically, which is never what it was intended to be in the first place. Whether or not it should even exist in the first place is a whole different conversation, but nevertheless it has, and here it is. But now it's basically being framed as, oh, you're taking away bread and water from, poor people, when in fact what you're doing is taking away their ability to promote transgenderism in Finland, or take your pick of whatever nation in the world. So it's absurd. It's an undermining thing. And so I think it's a great place for us to continue talking about rightly ordered affections, because ultimately what I'm hoping to do today, we focused last time on within our own borders. What does it look like within our own home, within our own city, within our church, our nation, our state, right? What does it look like then to extend that love beyond the borders? What is the actual proper place for affections internationally between nations? And then obviously missions. And so when I thought about this concept, I realized that USAID and all these organizations that are seeking to proselytize the nations into secularism, this is basically a mismanaged missions, right? That's exactly what it looks like to me, and it makes me think about how mismanaged our own Christian missions are, especially when, lo and behold, we start reading the numbers and there's a bunch of Christian mission agencies that are receiving funds from this entity. And so it really, I think, is a bit of a shocking revelation to realize how many evangelicals have been essentially on the hook. I mean, you take money from the government, there's going to always have strings attached. And so what's that look like?
Why did the government see you as being a qualified recipient of these funds?
Well, especially under the Biden administration, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Most of these numbers we're seeing are from 2022, 2023.
Yeah, Christianity Today was 2023, even though the prior year they hadn't received anything. So there's something about what's going on there. So I think that's great, and I think this is why we wanted to have this conversation so that our audience would engage with us. further on this topic. And I think where I would go first, before we kind of peel back the layers here a little bit further, the place that I want to go first is the recognition I think everybody's starting to have is the fact that this is our money.
Yeah.
So the beginning, so we're talking about ordered loves, and that we are to love our own people first. And when it comes to the nation, we love our own nation first. Like, so the government, the leadership of our nation is to be for the nation. This is why the America First messaging and tagline has been so important and effective, because it resonates with the people that have placed them in those roles and positions to actually govern for the good of their own people. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing the forcible taking of the people's hard-earned money and then redistributing it according to the secular desires without our knowledge, without any transparency, really against our will, and affecting regime changes around the world, and feeding. Well, people want to complain, oh, you're turning off the spigot of water and food for all these other people. Well, first of all, if they are depending upon us to be their daddy, that's a problem, and we shouldn't have done that in the first place. And we'll talk about what the right way to kind of go about that really
obviously
would be.
We do want to help where we can as Christians, but not the nation.
But you don't steal from your own people in order to feed the rest of the world.
Amen.
That's not what governments really are for. And that's a redistribution. So you're taking the people's money and you're redistributing it not just to other people within your own country that the government deems more worthy, but now you're redistributing it around the world in some humanitarian effort. And so I think that's a key element is the taxation is it's a legal plunder of your own people, which is actually going against the purpose of the government in the first place, which is to be for the people and to promote the freedoms and protect the rights of their own people. Yeah. And when you take their money from them, you're not protecting their rights to care for their own family and to spend their money as they seem fit. You're basically saying, as the government, we will take that money from you, and we will, because we know better how to spend that. That is theft, and that is hubris, and it is not the role of government to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you just hit the nail on the head with regards to the problem with our tax code as a nation, as a state, period, is that we have this weird idea that we're going to take all this money, impose all these taxes, and then we'll give you incentives to give you your own money back, instead of just not taking them in the first place. I mean, tax breaks should be the idea of we're just not going to tax you and take it in the first place. But that's not how we operate. We operate on this idea of we're going to take it, use it how we see fit, and then we'll give it back if we feel like it. And like that's completely backwards.
Well, because they see it as we are the servants of the government, and it is their money first. We live at their good graces. We live on this land because they are very kind to allow us to. Right? We're just renters. We're just people that they tolerate, and we're good so far as we fund the projects that they want to do.
We're human capital. We're basically being treated as if we're the fundraisers, if you will, for their agendas, rather than the people who the agendas are supposed to serve.
Now, while we're on this subject of taxation, we might as well just bring up the issue of tariffs. I think we might have brought it up a little bit last time, but this idea of tariffs, I think, which is taxation, but I think here it is a tax on the foreign nation. So again, you are then in a better situation looking out for the interest of your own people. But in a system wherein you have both internal taxation and external taxation, that's not what we need, and that can't be sustained, because ultimately all the prices are going to be felt by the populace of our own country. I like the tariffs. I love the tariffs. Beautiful tariffs.
18 hours is all it took to actually get something done.
They're actually a club, right? And especially when you have leverage, you have a big market and so forth, then you have the ability to use it as leverage. And that's what Trump is really doing. And he's a great negotiator. So he's using tariffs as leverage in order to get a better situation for our country and to get those other countries to do what we want them to do. And I think that's brilliant. I think that's good. He can use them, and I think the design would be ultimately that it would be a short-term element to get us in a better, positive situation as a country. Yeah. However, if the tariffs do go in, and they go in especially on a longer-term basis, and without the reduction of the taxes, the tax burden by for our own people.
Right. It needs to be a trade-off.
That's a double tax on us.
Yep.
So I liked the fact that there was at least something mentioned about the doing away of an income tax. Now I think that's sort of not going to happen. I think that's again a negotiating. You go to the far extreme and then you walk it back and it's less extreme.
Yeah.
But and I heard today some more talk about making the prior Trump administration tax cuts permanent. Obviously, I'm all for permanent tax cuts, but I do think it's very important that as we talk about plundering your own people, you can't stick us twice with the responsibility of paying for the taxes of other countries and our own income taxes and all the other taxes.
Right.
I think that's a long-term, and I think they know that. That's a trust element. We'll have to see how it all shakes out. I'm happy for the tariffs as a tool and an instrument, as a club, but it's not something that, of course, we would be for unless they replace the taxation on your own people.
Well, and if you think about it from an ethical standpoint, we have taxes taken out of our paycheck that we have zero control over. We have taxes, applied to the home that I own that I'm now leasing from the government, right? So those are all mandatory, compulsory. I can't avoid them. They're there, right? We have sales tax that we just have to pay, right? There's no way around it. At least with the tariff system, you're transferring that on. You now have some ownership, because if the price of goods goes up, basically how that cost is handed down to us is that the price of goods goes up ultimately. If we're going to charge them more for import-export, then naturally those goods will become more expensive because it's going to be more expensive to get it into the country in the first place, or vice versa. The difference is that I, as the consumer, can choose whether or not I want to pay the higher price.
You can buy American at that point.
Exactly. I can buy American. I can buy other goods. I can do without. I still at least have some level of liberty and control. But again, if that happens, plus I still am having my land taxed, plus I'm still having my paycheck taxed, then at that point, I think you're 100% right. We're getting taxed both ways, and it's ultimately bad for us. But if we can work towards an idea of, hey, we actually just want to have an established, stable cost for our goods, and then establish an economic trade system with foreign nations that is actually stabilized, I think it's going to avoid a lot of the central banking issues that we've experienced for the past 20, 30 years of this ebb and flow of interest rates and rising costs and low costs and inflation, deflation. So you know what that looks like? I'm not going to pretend I'm an economic expert, and I can certainly study the last 150 years and see how things like this have gone in the past. But no, I think at least it's a tool for the moment that I hope will produce good fruit in the long term for us. But yeah, I'd much rather have the freedom to choose rather than to have it imposed upon me.
Right. Well, before we get further down this road here, let's bring up the issue of immigration again, and let's talk about the thoughts, especially a lot of the pushback from evangelicals on this issue of immigration, and thinking about, well, we're supposed to love these other peoples and these other nations, and you and I have had some conversation and some interplay with this issue offline here, and wanting to identify the reality that immigration has a legitimate place. I would argue that we would that there's value in shutting it off completely, especially because we've taken in so many over a period of time, that I think zero immigration is a valuable position to hold, and at least for a period of time. And I'm totally happy with that. And I think that's the way we ought to go, especially because I think what's coming down the road is we're going to legalize a lot of the people that are here. We're not going to deport 30 million or whatever the number is of these illegals. Obviously, right now there's a lot of emphasis and talk about the criminal aliens, and then I did like what our press secretary said. Actually, they're all criminals because they're here illegally. So I'm hoping that they do have the will to go through with that and to deport way more. I think we got to deport millions of people. They're not. I doubt they're going to. So I think we're going to legalize way too many people, and then but for that reason, we need to then shut down immigration. What I would be still for, as long as you can manage it, is the concept of visitors, right? Like you can be here on a temporary work visa, potentially, right? You could have, travel and tourism and all sorts of things like that. It doesn't mean that you can't welcome sojourners and visitors. Right. And I think that's
isolationism, truly.
So let's go biblically, right? Obviously, Scripture talks about the way in which you treat sojourners and aliens, but that is an element. Those people weren't just being assimilated as citizens of Israel.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're typically out for trade reasons.
What are they
or
there for?
economic reasons. Yeah.
They're visitors.
Yep.
Okay. But we've turned this into in the leftist evangelical realm that if you have these refugees, like we have to take in all these refugees and they get to stay indefinitely. These refugees aren't going anywhere. We're not sending them back.
Yeah.
So I think the element of turning off the spigot to that sort of thing. I think if you're going to deal with refugees, you deal with refugees, and we can help internationally with dealing with. But they don't have to come here. They can go to their closest neighbors, and we can certainly help with that. I'm open to those conversations. But in terms of dealing with our own country and our responsibility that we have to feed them and house them and do all this type of stuff, I would argue if I'm president for the 3 glorious days, I would be. That's what I would do. I would shut off the entire thing, and yet be willing to have ordinary people come and do business, visit, tourism, those types of things, and we can treat those people wonderfully. We can love those people, but that's a different story.
And when we build up Christian universities, sure, you can come study. Right?
Yeah, international students.
Yeah, the only exception I think I'd add to that is more kind of in the strain of refugees, right? Lord willing, let's say we do actually have a Christian nation, where I would say is, when we do have other nations that are heavily persecuting Christians, I do think that that would be the area where we'd say, Christians trying to flee religious persecution, but they are legitimately Christian, wanting to pursue Christianity where they can openly practice. And again, obviously, there's something to be said about we need to Christianize those other nations. And so there's a time to fight, there's a time to flight, right? So a time for flight. So I'd say that'd be the only exception I'd add is in general is that, I think if we're going to be a Christian nation, we should be welcoming to Christians in particular that need, I guess, the ability. But again, that comes back into our conversation we had last week is like, well, what does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be, to fit into the culture of Christianity? That's a very different conversation than just talking about like tribes and ethnicities and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no Muslim refugees.
Exactly.
Period.
Right.
Yeah, no Muslim refugees.
Yeah, but there's plenty of Christians being persecuted in those nations, right?
And I could make that. I would happy to handle arguments that as a nation we can help people escape all kinds of persecution and death and suffering. But we would work with other nations. Other Muslim nations, to you take your people, you take your you take your neighbors. Even now, look, if there are refugees from Canada, when they're a close neighbor, you could see where you could give them some opportunity. But the idea, I'm 100% with you, so I wouldn't say it's an exception at all. I would argue we just are talking about different time frames. That currently you shut everything off, but I agree with you. As a Christian nation, the only people, immigration and refugees are only Christians.
I want to bring in people that are going to build the culture, want to build what we are, and want to be particularly what an American Christian looks like as well. And we recognize that might look different in other parts of the world. To be a Bulgarian Christian or to be a Japanese Christian or to be an Australian Christian is going to look slightly different, even though we all have a common faith. Praise be to God. So, no, I think it's a good conversation to have. We recognize that concept of trying to prioritize the needs of my closest neighbors, right? I think it was Martin Luther, talked about his wife as his closest neighbor, that as I'm supposed to love, my neighbor, I should love my closest neighbor most dearly, right? This is Martin Luther. So this is a Christian concept that's been around for hundreds, and all the way back to Augustine and before. So, and you can see it in the scripture itself. It shouldn't be controversial, but that doesn't mean, obviously, that we're denying, because when you see the progressive Christians, what are they all saying? Love the foreigner. They take the parable of the Good Samaritan. They're focusing on foreign love.
That's exactly where I was.
So do we hate all foreigners?
No, listen. The Good Samaritan loved the person in front of him.
In his own borders.
The guy he was walking past.
Correct.
So we talked about that a little bit last time, so we won't belabor it. But the evangelical backlash of the so-called theologians was really ridiculous, using the parable of the Good Samaritan as an argument because we need to argue. We need to love people who are different from us and who don't share certain. It's the person right in front. It was literally at the time that was his closest neighbor in need. Period. So it doesn't rule out anything that we're saying.
But he was a Samaritan. So he technically was a foreigner himself, right? No.
Well, the point is that it's whoever's in front of you. Who's my neighbor?
Correct.
That's the person that I have. Is everyone my neighbor? Yes, if I come across them, it's everyone I
Sure.
actually come in
Well,
contact
well, and I
with.
think that's the challenge, right? So that's really the challenge is because we live in a sort of a globalized, world,
Mhm.
and because of things like technology, the person on the other side of the planet is in the palm of my hand, right? So I think where the reason why this is so easy to conflate and to confuse is because the people on the other side of the planet feel like they're right next door to us
Sometimes I get
because of
emails from them,
right, right.
right? They're
Sure.
asking,
I get
what?
that church email all the time.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Would you please, dear brother,
Yes.
please help us out and send us money. It's like,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Also, scam.
Yeah, right.
So there are some elements to that, but I know what you're saying.
I think
But
that's why a lot of Christians get confused about it, though, is because they see these videos. Like we have access to videos. If you think 200-300 years ago, you didn't know what was going on the other side of the planet.
ordinarily, the only thing I can do for them is pray for them.
Correct.
So in that way, yes, I can love them. But in terms of the tangible, financial,
Right.
time and personal interaction and personal love to be extended, there's going to be limits. And so that's why even on the digital side of things, it's still going to be limited. The big idea is it's still going to be the ordinary understanding of the order amoris is the same. You love your own first, your closest neighbors, your family first, and that extends from there
Right.
as you are able and as you have contact and knowledge of those things and ability. So I think that's really important.
But that's it, right? You didn't say and then stop, right?
Yeah.
So just to be clear, is that when we say that we're talking about rightly ordered affections, there is a love for the whole world, right? God loved the whole world. So yes, we're going to love the world as the bride of Christ. We're going to, make that love effectual in the way that we interact with one another and the way that we engage with other nations. Obviously, we'll get into the sort of the context of missions and what that should look like because that's a whole other bucket of problems, really. But obviously, we're also called to love our enemies. So the Muslim that I don't want to live across the street from me, I still have love for. I have love for my neighbor by keeping them away from my neighbor to protect them from the influence of a ungodly demonic religion that seeks our harm, but I'm also going to show love for that person by preaching the gospel to them, still trying to bring Christ to them as best I can to engage. Right there's not we create a false dichotomy when we say that the love that I have for that person has to look like the same love as I show my wife and kids. Right. Obviously, again, if that person was here across the street from me, injured, I'm going to care for them regardless of who they are or where they're from.
Right.
That's what I do because I'm called to show compassion, right? And to obey the commandments. If I'm not supposed to kill, right, not supposed to murder unjustly, then I'm also supposed to preserve life. So we recognize that extends there. But I think where a lot of Christians get confused is they try to sort of level it and treat everything the same. We're just going to turn it into sort of one even playing field that my love for everyone looks exactly the same no matter where they are, where they're from. But if they're a Christian brother, then we elevate it. So even people that say that they reject the concept of ordo amoris, functionally, they actually don't because
That's right.
they're always going to say, we'll treat Christians better. Well, that's a form of ordo amoris, right? So what does that look like?
Yeah, that's very good. So then we get into this issue of international elements. So we've seen from the USAID this idea of international extension of secularism. It's a missions organization of the federal government to spread leftist woke ideologies and secularism around the world, also influencing our own country. And so it's a missions organization. Well, let's talk a little bit about missions. How do we rightly show Christian compassion and mercy to the whole world and obey the Great Commission? So let's talk about like real missions. Let's talk about Christian missions. Let's first start with the state of affairs.
Sure.
Let's talk about missions now as they exist and how people perceive of them and think of them and the way in which even churches support them. What is your initial thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of huge issues with most missions organizations. I'll just hit two or three big ones that I've observed. One, a lot of mission organizations are completely detached from any sense of local congregationalism, any sort of accountability to eldership. So a huge problem with modern evangelical missions and really even Catholic missions, things like that as well, even though they're obviously attached to their whole ecclesiastical system, they still have their own issues. But let's just focus on evangelical Protestants, right? There's no accountability. So you have from that, they're accountable to their donors, and a lot of times their donors are various churches. So in the biblical model of missions, you have a pastor going out, training pastors, planting churches. That was sort of the biblical model for missions. And so what that's
Missionaries are elder qualified men.
Exactly. And so now I get into my 2 and 3. My 2 and 3 is that the mission field, if you will, is overwhelmingly, if you read the statistics, filled by women. Frankly, the number of women in the mission field is substantially grown over the past 50 years. Now, I'm not saying that women should be prohibited in all shapes and sizes, but that's a whole different discussion.
We like women of all shapes and sizes.
That was poorly spoken.
Okay,
that's great. No, I mean obviously there is there's a place for women in the mission field, particularly in husband-wife scenarios. That being said, depending on where you're going, I think it shows utter lack of love for your wife to bring her in those contexts, or even to pursue marriage, but that's another thing. But yeah, so the overwhelming amount of women in the mission field is a problem. And then 3, I think the huge issue is it's not focused on doctrine and the gospel and church planting. The vast majority of Christian missions, quote unquote, are simply just humanitarian aid that you wouldn't even be able to tell were Christian organizations if you were just to observe their operations. Well, and I think that all flows from the first issue, that there's no actual accountability. If we sent out a missionary from our church local, from your church, say our 2 churches got together, we're going to fund this guy and he's going to go somewhere. That guy's reporting to us. He's still under church discipline, submission. There is accountability, and there's a real doctrinal training that would happen, and also an accountability for that.
We've outsourced it all.
Yeah, we've outsourced it. We've created missions organizations. You look at guys like William Carey and some of those that have done a lot of great good. But it also led to this advancement of sort of international Bible mission societies and things like that ultimately have, I think, done a lot of disservice to the mission itself.
Well, what passes for missions a lot today is primarily support, quote unquote, support missions. And so, for instance, we were dealing with a number of years ago at a prior church, the pursuit of a young woman, and we're going to call her a missionary. And she's going to go to South America, to a particular country where she's really going to emphasize her ability to take photographs. She's going to help with, she's going to, of course, minister to some of the kids. She'll do some VBS stuff,
Sure.
But she's going to support these other missionaries through her media capabilities and helping them put together their slideshows for their home support groups and so forth.
Sure.
Like that, and all this type of stuff. What's happened? The whole missions thing has been hijacked because similar to a number of other things, perhaps in the government, in evangelicalism, if you attach the label missionary or
Sure. missions
to something, what does that entitle you to? Funds, money,
Mm-hmm.
because that's not a missionary. Okay, what she is a Christian living as a Christian in another nation.
Yeah.
That's all that she's doing. She's just being a woman in another country. There's nothing missions about anything that she's doing.
Right.
We've lost any concept of that definitional aspect of the spreading of the gospel, of planting of churches,
Right.
of raising up and discipling men to shepherd and to do the indigenous people, to minister the gospel.
Bible translation, like Wycliffe,
putting the word of God into the
Great
hands
stuff.
of other people. Those are ordinary concepts of missions that we've now really spread so thin that a missionary is just someone that is entitled, that you've slapped a label on someone to go do a good thing somewhere else,
Right.
to go be a Christian somewhere. Basically, all we're doing is we're funding other people to live in other countries.
Yeah. Yeah, and
That's it.
obviously, the idea there is, well, they're going to have Christian influence, so they're going to have some sort of, impact on the society because at least it's a Christian, a higher number of Christians living there than there were before. So I get that concept, but if you think about that, that's exactly how you framed it. So the other thing to consider there too is that really what this is a framing of is that a lot of Christian organizations are concerned with giving people bread, but not the bread of life. They're concerned with giving them, tangible needs,
So that's the other
but
one,
not
humanitarian
Christ.
missions,
Right.
not church-based
Right,
missions.
and that's not to say that we shouldn't. James says that caring true religion is caring for orphans and widows. So obviously, if we see someone who needs a cloak and we don't give them a cloak, or if we see someone who needs food, absolutely,
It's
yes
just
and
way
amen.
out of proportion.
Right, but all we're doing is making them comfortable on the way to hell if we're not actually preaching the gospel, right? So what good does that actually do? You're just prolonging suffering. So we need to fix that.
Our engineer has done some crack research here for us on the fly, which is
my
great.
goodness.
He's given us a statistic that 70 to 80% of single Christian missionaries from the USA are female.
I wonder if that includes LDS. No.
So
is that just Christian?
So actually, what Mark has given us here is actually it's helpful to refresh my memory and reboot some things from the past, because actually that's what a lot of it is. You have sincere, lovely, in many ways godly young women who are without a spouse, and they want to love the Lord, they want to serve the Lord, and they don't know what to do with their lives, and so they're encouraged to get involved in missions. And what a lot of that ends up being is, you can't find a husband here, perhaps you can find him over there. That's part of it.
But it also decreases the available godly women for the men to pursue, right?
100%. But there's a sincerity, so I'm not questioning sincerity there. The issue is just we've gotten out of whack with what we understand missionaries to be, and we're spreading our missions dollars thin on things that are, as opposed to focusing them on those real mission works that align with Scripture, right?
Right.
And so, it becomes a single women don't know what else to do with their life. We might as well do something good, and we're going to fund them to go. And that, by the way, when you do that too, in many respects, they're outside of the headship and care and watchful eye of their fathers. And so they're in some ways unprotected, or very significantly less protected than they ought to be under their own father's household. So I think this evangelical modern missions today is a real problem, and I think a lot of churches just, you know what, if we're just doing good things, we feel better about ourselves because we put it under the umbrella of our missions budget.
Yeah, it's a checkbox on the annual budget where
we're doing good.
You're doing good. Right?
We're doing good.
And that's not to say that there aren't some good things that have come, right? I think of like Amy Carmichael, or you can name these various ladies that are always trumpeted, frankly, whenever I make a big point about no lady pastors. Like, well, what about Elizabeth Elliot? And it's like, okay, yeah, she had a lot of good things to do. She also was there with her husband, and then with also her second husband, who also died, right? So, you have these stories, and they try to take these exceptional stories that still have their problems, because frankly, you still have ladies exercising some more authority than they probably should be over training these indigenous people. But even in those circumstances, they're still the exception. Like the story you told, I think the average young lady in the quota there is probably doing secretarial work for some organization overseas. She's not starting orphanages typically, right? So. Again, I don't want to downplay the faithfulness or the genuine desire of many of these young ladies to do good works. But what that tells me actually is we have a father issue and we have a young man issue. We don't have enough young men building careers, building households, and pursuing wives. That's what that tells me.
That certainly is a big part of that. But I think we also have just lost our way in terms of missions. Yep. We've lost a proper philosophy of missions.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think when we've lost that, then anything goes, and you can start just moving pieces around that actually don't belong there, and really you end up with other things like, look, we can be really hard on the USAID when a lot of our churches need to have some scrutiny upon the way in which they view missions, because actually there's a lot of garbage stuff that churches are spending money on that the people are donating.
Yep.
Pretty
sure the SBC could use the Doge right now.
There's a lot of that, and I think that we've got to have a greater sense of what our donations to our churches for missions are meant to be for. And so we need to be clean with that. We need to be principled with that. And I think we need to be biblical in our philosophy for what we spend our money on. And instead, we're just paying for Christians to just be Christians somewhere else.
Right.
That's not missions.
Yep. Well, and that's one thing I did appreciate about my, my previous church is we would pray for a different missionary each week as part of our sort of prayer petition, and we would sort of give updates and reports. We'd explain what they were doing, to the congregation. We would say, hey, this is what we're funding. This is what it's going towards. This is what they're doing. We had one family that, he trained to be a pilot with MAF and was in South America for several years. So there are appropriate extensions. Where I think you're right on the money, though, is that we've extended the term, this umbrella term of missions, to apply to a lot of just Christian good works.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, like what does MAF do? MAF's a great organization in a lot of ways, right? They fly people around. They're the transportation and courier system for a lot of other missions organizations. So sometimes they're transporting, pastors that need to get from a remote area to this training school or something. Sometimes they're transporting, humanitarian efforts, right? But they're not actually doing the theological training or anything themselves. Is that really a missions organization, or is it just a Christian organization that seeks to build up the kingdom? Like it's a weird umbrella we've created.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's what I was going to get to. That's the problem, because it all falls into one big bucket.
Correct.
It's one big bucket we call missions, and anything good goes in it. And but see, that's what I was getting at before. If you just put the label missions on it, it entitles you to fundraise for it. Because who's going to argue with missions? Wait, do you not love people? Do you not care about their lives? Do you not care about these are good works? And it's all these, all sorts of different missions, good stuff. But let's be clear about what we're doing here.
Sure.
You can have initiatives for those things if you want to pay for people to be Christians somewhere else. But let's just be very clear. That is not the missions that we see instituted and exemplified in the New Testament. That is not the same thing.
Well, it's perfect, because that's what I was going to ask you next is what did the first missionaries look like, scripturally speaking?
So interesting that you asked that, because I had as I was reviewing some of the notes on this, one of the things that struck me recently is the fact that Paul went as a citizen, as a missionary in Rome, the Roman territories.
Right.
Paul was in some ways not being a foreign missionary. Right. Granted, he's a Jewish man, part of the Jewish Sanhedrin. It's not, but he had Roman citizenship.
Right.
So he's a citizen of all of these territories. He never left Roman territory.
It's almost like God providentially called him for that reason.
But my point here is, in some ways, you could even refer to that as domestic missions.
Sure.
Because he's going within the territories that he is a citizen in. So when we talk about going to, if I go to Mexico, one of our nearest neighbors, and I'm a missionary to Mexico, I'm actually doing something a little bit different than what Paul is doing, because I'm not a citizen of Mexico. Now,
Right.
I'm not going to try to say that we don't do international missions. I'm just making the point that as Paul's doing missions, he's doing so in some measure domestically,
Right.
as a Roman citizen to other Roman citizens. So if we were to talk about missions, I think one of the things that we need to talk about is the reality of domestic church planting.
Absolutely.
is what we would call missions. And actually, that is not the normal understanding of the way a lot of, I would say, well, I already said normal. It's not the normal understanding of the way in which churches view missions, because they view missions and church planting, domestic church planting, those are two different buckets. They don't even call
Right.
a domestic church plant a missions.
But that's exactly what it is.
That's exactly what it
Which
is.
is interesting, because, what do we have in Boise for the homeless? It's the rescue mission, right? So we have a concept for local missions, if you will, but we've sort of isolated it to one context. But I'm 100% with you. We were planted out of a church in Southern California, and that church funded us for a while. And so in a sense, we were a mission, and we still receive support from various churches and people and individuals that want to support our young church. And so in that regard, we're being treated as a mission by these various peoples.
But a lot of times,
But that's not normal.
well, I know it's not normal, but a lot of times also, you're going to be treated still differently than that international mission. Because
Right.
that international mission will receive funding in perpetuity, practically.
Right.
I mean,
And
very
with zero accountability, whereas I'm giving reports probably.
right. Whereas, hey, we'll give you a try. We'll give you a trial period of like 3 years, but you better get on your own real fast.
Correct.
There's just a lot of different. There's a different attitude. There's a different perspective, because
Well, you're right.
it's not
You're
special.
training up something so that it's almost like train someone to fish so that they can feed themselves, right? It's sort of the context there is that a lot of international missions we treat as just a perpetual gravy train that needs to be sustained. Whereas with like a church plant, the idea is that you're going to sustain yourself at some point, which if you think about it, international church planting should be the same way. You should be training up local people to be local pastors to sustain themselves. So if the gospel is going forth and being blessed.
Yeah, to some extent, in terms of even what we need to see in the government, that instead of these agencies, they should be task forces that when they accomplish their mission, they move on and they go out of existence. So in some regard, a missionary let's go back to your original question about the biblical concept of that. In terms of the biblical concept of missions, what you have is the work of evangelism done by elder qualified men to the community, the cities that they would go
already
to.
Most missions have failed. Keep going.
Right. We're already off the rails. You have elder qualified men going in and doing evangelism, wherein they establish a new church. They appoint leaders in that church, indigenous people in that area. So you think of Paul appointing Titus to raise up elders and gives them the qualifications, gives them the instructions on the island of Crete, and to make sure that these then churches are viable, self-sustaining, and able to move forward in the gospel ministry in those places. So in one of the contexts that I grew up in, it was a drumbeat of that church, which I thought was very helpful, is that missions is in large part about church planting. So that's what we see Paul doing, right? That's what we see the first century apostles and those missionaries with them. That's really what they're doing. That's their mission. And then their letters. What are the letters of the New Testament? They are actually writing back to the churches to strengthen them, to encourage them, to correct the problems that after the apostles leave, we got to actually fight off some wolves. We've got to
there's some accountability.
Teaching.
You're going to take some responsibility for them, right?
So, and he sees them as children in the faith. He's a father in the faith. All these types of things. So it's really the major focus is getting the gospel. And look, and if you preach the gospel in a particular place and they reject you, you shake off the dust from your feet and you move on to the next place and you keep going. And but that's not generally what we're seeing with missions today. Missions today, again, is I keep going back to this, but it's radio stations, it's hospitals, it's developing food situations, it's taking pictures. It's
mercy ministries that are being under the guise of missions.
Well, I'm going to call myself a missionary while I go support the missionaries.
Right. Yep.
And everybody's all in the same funding bucket. Anyway, getting back to your question, so we have to get back to elder qualified men.
Yeah. Amen.
And with their families or single, but you have elder qualified men. You then go into places. You seek to plant churches, and part of that is you're training up that generation of pastors to take over and establish those churches for long-term health. And that's where I think a valuable model in that, a valuable model in that is the training center model, the seminary type model,
correct,
where you do have people teaching sound doctrine, which is strengthening the churches and teaching them so that they can stand on their own. And ultimately, they take over the seminary and you leave and you move it on to somewhere else.
Especially when you see how many missions organizations have brought heresy throughout the world. You look at why is charismania such a thing in so many third world countries? Well, they're poor, so prosperity gospel is attractive to begin with in a lot of cases, but also it's because we've brought in foreign false doctrine, and sometimes into areas that already had a Christian tradition that was solid, right? May not have been, very large, but we've taken into an area where it maybe was just kind of stagnant, and then we've actually, made sons of hell in a lot of ways. There's a danger there. If I can pull a thread through the kind of all these concepts, kind of time together here for a second, I think would be helpful. Where do we even get the word missions from? Well, the Great Commission is the foundation for missions, if you think about it. And so in light of the concept of Ordo Amoris, here's a comparison that we should consider, right? We're ordering our love going from nearest to farthest, because that's how missions works, because that's how the gospel works, that's how evangelism works. What was the Great Commission? To Jerusalem, Judea,
and the
Samaria,
and
to the ends of the world. And so what does that look like for us? Our own home, we're going to be missionaries to our family, to our city, to our local neighbors, to our state, to our nation, then to the world. That's what missions looks like. And when we build Christian nations, if we become training centers to send out, absolutely. But we train to send out so that we might build up more training centers and we can partner. And this is one of the reasons why, Lord willing, as the world becomes Christianized, we have more and more nations that we can partner with as Christian nations. We can network for these sorts of purposes. But if you think about that, we literally have this model in Scripture. We start here at home, because why would you go across the world first when you have your own neighbors that you should be preaching to?
But Gabe, didn't you know that we already are a Christian nation? We've been Christianized. So don't you know how rich we are compared to the rest of the world? That they need it more than we do.
Well, okay, yeah.
No, I'm sharing with you
Yeah, I
that
gotcha.
that argument.
I know that's ironic. Trust me, I'm just. Sorry, in my mind, I'm having flashes of Paula White or whatever her name being. It's like we have all these like giant W's coming across the screen every time I look at any news feed, and then I see, hey, we're gonna have a Department of Faith, and they
Paula
make
White.
Paula White, is that her name? Yeah. That's obviously incredibly frustrating, but again, like you care for the gospel proclamation here, and the reason why I brought that up is, if you think about it, if you pursue sort of Christian nationalist ideas without actually being truly Christian, you're going to end up with Paula White as the head of your faith department. Does that make sense? So we can't have a Christless paleo-conservatism. We need to have a true Christ-filled paleo-conservatism.
So let's talk then about. So we have an idea. We've already talked about the biblical philosophy of missions has to do with the preaching of the gospel. It has to do with planting of churches. It has to do with elder qualified men. It has to do with training up the indigenous people to stand on their own 2 feet, to establish eldership and leadership in the church, wherein they're discipled into obeying all that Christ has commanded.
Right.
So all of those types of things.
Because the tangible things follow. What does James command, right? The idea there is that the humanitarian stuff is you teach them to have a Christian perspective and a biblical perspective on the world, so that it actually encourages work ethic.
You airdrop fish.
Yeah, no. Right. No, this the idea, though, is that the Christian worldview actually transforms societies. Again, the idea is not to obliterate every culture. We want the cultures to be redeemed, not completely replaced. So that's not the idea. But when you bring the gospel to bear on a people, they then learn motivation for what the purpose of life is. And guess what? They start feeding themselves.
And then we start to have more in common, actually.
Exactly.
We start to have more in
Partnership.
common. It's not the exact same thing as cultural transplantation, but it is. We end up having more in common if we share biblical values and work ethics and all those types of things. So yeah, I think that's good. I think you're right. You will actually have less need for humanitarian aid and all those goodies. But what we want to do is, typically today, is we want to feel good about ourselves by all of the things we just give to other people. As opposed
because it's easy.
It's easier, but we give them it's opposed to giving them a worldview that allows them to function and support themselves, to feed their own families, and to reverse it. Right? Okay. Now you guys love your own, and then you guys love your nearest neighbors, and then then you can send love in different directions and beyond your own borders.
Sure.
But I do. Let's move a little bit to the idea of humanitarian aid. Maybe there's a tragedy. Maybe you already mentioned the idea of Christian refugees who are being persecuted and so forth.
Yeah,
is there a place,
Boko Haram kind of situation?
Is there a place for churches to do that kind of humanitarian? We're calling it humanitarian work. Obviously, a lot of people would just lump it under missions. Would you see those things as different? Would you see those things as different categories within? Let's just say it's a church budget or it's a denominational budget or so forth. Would you put those in different categories? Would you try to be cleaner and say missions this, and loving our extended neighbors,
sure,
in a different category? Was that how you would handle that?
Yeah. So I think if I were to actually lay these out in categories biblically, missions I would treat as both foreign and domestic church planting.
Yes.
That's missions, right?
Yes.
So if I'm going to be looking at my my budget for the year, under the missions header, I would have domestic church planting opportunities. Us multiplying ourselves here locally or within the borders of our nation, whatever that may be looking like. And then foreign. There could be foreign church planting efforts as well. What I would put, what you're talking about, what most people think of missions, sort of the humanitarian aid, that really falls under benevolence, right? Mm-hmm. So the function of the deacons in a lot of places to provide benevolence, sometimes that's, referred to as various different names, but it's mercy ministries, right? So that can, again, also fall into domestic and foreign. So what does that look like? Well, we have a need to care for the members of the household of the faith, is what we're told. More than we have a obligation, I guess, to care for all of our neighbors to a certain degree, but especially the household of faith, right? So the idea there is that if we have a benevolence fund, you have a family in your church, their house burns down, there's a tragedy, you have the ability to have financial resources, food, clothing, whatever that may be. The church acts as the church to care for the needs of that. They're going to be your first priority. But there's definitely nothing wrong with also obeying Scripture that has room for mercy and benevolence to those who might be beyond the borders of your city, nation, state, etc.
And as we're talking, I think we need to probably just clean up our own categories in our own church, because I think so. We support Hope Pregnancy Center in Ontario, but we've kind of all thrown it into the missions category.
It's really a benevolence.
And it's really benevolence ministry. We actually need to clean that up. We need to change that. And we're in the budget season right now, so we'll adjust that budget, because that's actually not filling, like we've done that. It's easy to do that, right? Because it becomes
and I'm saying this on the
extra.
fly, and I'm recognizing, church budgets I've been in charge of in the past. That's not how we categorized it. Yeah. But as I'm thinking about it in light of our conversation, that's really how it should be.
Well, it's helpful just to make them clean categories to help ourselves, but help everybody understand what these are and why they're different.
Well, also, exactly. It's catechizing your people to know what the money's actually doing, right?
Right. And while there is an element to where there is a missions element to Hope Pregnancy Center, because they are preaching the gospel to the women and the children, it is disconnected from the local church, and so there is an elder qualified man leading that ministry. We'd have to maybe look at it a little bit, a little bit closer.
It's kind of a gray area one.
It's a little bit of a crossover, but it is a local element,
right? So where did this sort of evangelist fall into this? Because not every evangelist is a church planner, and so that's where you take a look at like abolition ministry, for example. They're preaching the gospel, they're doing good work. Is that a
at the same time they're seeking to save lives, right? Which is not directly identified with the gospel. It's identified with justice.
Are you saying that it's not a gospel-centered ministry?
Gospel centered.
TGC and G3 are very upset with you.
Mark's about to throw his headset.
that was a joke.
No, I know it's a joke. No, that whole gospel centered stuff has gotten kind of weird. But I think we do have to, I think, work at keeping our categories cleaner. Otherwise, you end up having a muddled mess under the umbrella of missions. And because we're doing good things, because we're doing things related to life, and the gospel is present and preached, that doesn't necessarily make it the same missions. But, you're doing Christian things,
right?
But it's not the same thing as biblical missions.
Yeah, it's caring for the orphan and the widow, right? That concept, to take that biblical principle and extrapolate that out, is that we do have, there's nothing wrong with Christians who want to go dig wells. Right? There's nothing wrong with Christians that want to, say you have a Christian who's an engineer.
And you can fund those.
Yeah, you can fund that, but that's not mission work, right?
Let's just be clear.
That's benevolence, that's mercy towards fellow humans even, but especially towards fellow Christians. There's a lot of, as much as we have experienced some persecution in recent years as Christians in our nation, I don't think we have a true appreciation for the persecuted church at large. Oftentimes when you have a missionary come and they talk about the persecuted church, it's all within the context of, oppression and suppression of truth and communism or Islam, whatever it may be. But we also hear how much the persecuted church is thriving theologically, right? So what is the pressing need for some of those people?
I've heard that.
Right. So I've heard, right? So what is actually the pressing need in those cases? Is it benevolence? Do they need food and water? Well, no, they need their culture to be redeemed, and they need to outnumber the masses that are suppressing the gospel, right? They actually need their regimes to be overthrown so that the gospel might, that's their actual pressing need. So I'd love to see, pressing needs in a missional context. I'd like to hear a lecture on how you're going to overthrow, the communism in China, right? But that's not what missionaries talk about at their conferences.
Yeah, no, they don't. This is a good and interesting topic. Well, let's see here. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and let's see. Is there anything else you want to kind of wrap things up with?
I think let's tie it back then. I think where we want to finish this then, considering that we've talked about immigration, missions, what I've tried to drive home here is that really it's the church who should be funding the vast majority of humanitarian aid. So,
let's go back.
So what would be? Let's move this back to the national level, right? So we've talked about what missions actually should look like.
Let's talk about an ideal Christian nation.
So let's say in a Christian nation, what is the nation's obligation for humanitarian aid? Is that such a thing, or should it be purely from the church? I would make an argument that hospitals and orphanages and many of those things really should be ministries of the church rather than necessarily socialized institutions or state-funded institutions. There's a lot of benefit from having the church be the one that governs and drives the charitable force of the world, caring for the needs of people. But what does that look like for the nation?
Well, so let's go back to where we started from. The job of a nation, of the government of a people, is not to be the provider and the provider of food and resources for the rest of the world.
Right.
That is not their function. They are primarily in place to care for their own people, and they are to bear the sword. Yep, they're to bear the sword in a defense and in a just sort of way. So therefore, if you're not going to steal the people's money to then be the all-wise, all-knowing redistributor of resources, then what you do is you do leave it up to the care and the love of your people to decide how best to handle the issues of humanitarian aid. So these are benevolence works in other countries. You mentioned hospitals. Hospitals are good things. Let's make sure that's not the same thing as missions. We've already covered that.
Right.
But it's still good things to do. And you prioritize Christian nations. Mm-hmm. You prioritize our own, especially the household of faith, as Paul references. So what you do is, if the people have so much more of their own money, they then have the ability to be generous. Now, well, what if they don't? What if they don't love?
Well, that's the pastor's job to teach and prophesy, not the nation's, right?
Right, and it's not the government that has to force that upon you by confiscating your resources.
Correct.
That's not what they're for. So it does call for freedom, and it calls for the churches to lead the way in benevolence and in missions throughout the world. Now it doesn't have to come directly from the elders of the church, but you can have Christian organizations,
right,
charities that do these things, develop hospitals and so forth. But in terms of the governments building hospitals in Egypt or pick a country, no.
Yeah, that's not their function.
That's not
right?
their function.
It's not what it's created to do.
And here's another aspect. Listen. One of the aspects of being non-Christian countries is you are likely going to cause your people more suffering.
Right.
And bailing that out by
I'm glad you brought that
just giving them stuff, and by propping them up.
Is it catechizing the people of their need of a savior?
Actually, their people would probably end up revolting and overthrowing their government and recognizing the bankruptcy of all of the theft and the corruption of their own countries. As if we didn't prop up the nation that was there, or prop up the people that are there. There's a lot of possibilities there, but the issue is that it's not the government's role to do that. We end up being the world's policeman. We've heard those types of problems and issues.
Sure.
But we become the world's we become little g God to the rest of the world, fixing all the problems of the world. That's garbage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as much as I think you brought up a good point earlier with regards to bearing the sword, there is obviously a place for our military, obviously, and military efforts, and that actually can be used as a tool or an instrument in certain cases.
You can have allies.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Yeah, you can have allies.
Well, I mean also, obviously, protecting our neighbor, loving our neighbor, like we use the example of the household and, defending our own household because I love my wife and children. That's a proper use of my love and my authority. That does extend to the nation as well. So protecting our borders, that's the point of the federal government. That's been widely overplayed, obviously, but that is a proper function. And so there may even be, we were talking before we started recording, as in the podcast, before the podcast, as you like to call it.
Yep.
Why don't you talk about what you were talking about earlier as far as there may be a place for humanitarian efforts or benevolence efforts of the church to be aided by the government with regards to perhaps transportation or defense, things like that. There might be a proper place of aligning it, but we shouldn't be using taxpayer money without transparency to actually do the thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. What would that look like? It was an interesting conversation.
So yeah, one of the things I brought up was that, again, keeping the function of government within its own lane, without usurping or going beyond what government's function is. Government can support the charitable efforts of its people through protection and and transport. There could be things that the government
Ensuring safety.
ensures that those good things and their people and their resources are not. Look, what's one of the problems that we have today? We're sending money over to Ukraine. It
You
just
have no idea where it's going.
and where did it go? And even Zelensky's like, yeah, I only got this amount. But yeah, but that's not the amount that we said that we sent. So clearly there is a role for the government to make sure that that whatever we're doing in a humanitarian and a benevolent sort of way is being protected and is getting to the place where it needs to be. So there is a protection, physical protection. There is a legal protection. There is a diplomatic element that that they can do to help facilitate our people entering other countries. There's a role of government that can be played there.
Diplomatic's a huge thing, So the concept of foreign embassies is not in and of itself a bad thing, especially when you're talking about the context of church planting. Having someone who is going to be a representative and an advocate for American citizens abroad who are pursuing church planting and evangelistic efforts is I think a right function of the government.
If Trump comes in and says, if you don't allow our missionaries into your country to preach the gospel, tariffs. I mean, that would be a legitimate form of government to promote the good, to promote the blessings, and you could do that. That there's a proper role of government there to make sure that our people are facilitated in a way, but it keeps them in their lane.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the limitation should be, as opposed to the government being the charitable organization that that are funded by theft.
Well, and to go back to the beginning of this conversation, I referred to sort of the secular agenda of the spending of U.S. aid, and so it's not that we're against the federal government or the national government or sort of the civil sphere, if you will, of institutional authority promoting a religious or value system. We're not against that, obviously. We're encouraging that they promote Christianity.
The right one.
We want them to promote the truth, not just because it's the truth and we want to see the gospel promulgated and more people saved. Like, obviously, that's our first goal, just in case that needs to be stated for anyone that doesn't want to read between the lines. It's the obvious presupposition here. But obviously, that's our first aim. But also because it's going to actually bring about the highest good for our neighbor. It's actually the way to love our neighbor, because the Christian belief system, the Christian religion, the one true way is what actually produces life. Jesus says he comes to give life abundantly. Yes, that is spiritual. Yes, that is eternal, but it's also the fruit of obedience to God's law. When you obey God's word, sorry, I'm all jazzed up. I'm preaching 1 John right now, and so I'm right on that chapter 2 this week. But so I've been studying a lot. But when you obey God, it actually shows that you know God. Right? You actually have union with him when we live in obedience to him. And so there is actually fruit that comes with that to the nations. And so we have an opportunity to actually love our neighbors locally and abroad by bringing the Christian gospel to the world.
The best humanitarian effort around the world is the gospel.
Yes.
Right? And as in
all its extent,
the hearts and minds, as the hearts and minds change and are conformed to God's word, that is going to result in good works, in human flourishing, and all those wonderful things. Right
now, can the gospel be preached to nations? There's the question. Let's hear it. Once and for all, clear up the dispute that's been wrecking the Reformed world for at least 18 months.
What's a nation? I don't know. What's
collection of households? So you're saying that if a bunch of people get saved, the nation could be proselytized to Christ?
Of course. And a nation, yes, a nation. You can have, contrary to many evangelifish out there, you have nations can be Christian.
Can you have a king of Nineveh moment where he repents in sackcloth and ashes and the entire nation converts?
Absolutely.
Do you think our God can still do that?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think a lot of Christians need to remember that. We preach the gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation. And I think we forget that sometimes. That if you think about the influence that a president or a king or someone has, it's massive. May there be false converts? Sure. But God also, the work of revival, the work of sort of true reformation, God uses people in authority.
The church has been spending so much time in my lifetime diminishing that concept of the importance and value of what a leader is capable of doing.
Right.
And we see this with Donald Trump, actually. Again, not as the ideal Christian leader, but in terms of a strong leader.
Yeah, imagine if he was truly regenerate.
What a fantastic leader he is. And he's a fantastic people person. He cares about a lot of people. I think it's fantastic. But also, there's other elements. Look, we can work with non-Christian leaders, and we see this in Ezra and Nehemiah.
Co-belligerents, right?
Where they've actually been very benevolent towards. I see Trump more along those lines, where hey, not necessarily a Christian. A Christian prince or Christian president in that way, but he's friendly and he's actually seeking to do good by us. And we can be grateful for that. And that doesn't mean that we've gone as far as we need to go, but the influence that he has in the ability to push back and to change minds and the directions and the ethos of the way in which a people view themselves and way in which they view the world around them can have a great impact where again, let's get back to where we've kind of talked about before. We've been given a great reprieve at this time. The issue is, are we going to press forward, or not to get into this new subject once again, but are we going to press forward, or are we going to be like the pro-life community says, oh, wait a minute, we've got an advantage, so make everybody freeze, don't move. I thought that was an interesting element. Whereas now the church wants, well, let's not press any advantage, or let's not make any people dislike us anymore. No, it's actually, this is the time to actually press forward, and leadership gives that opportunity, and it's such an important element. So the point being,
that's a great opportunity.
Is if we have more Christians rise up to be well-qualified leaders, and to then be in positions of leadership of countries like a Constantine or like other Christian princes, you actually have the ability to do great good to Christianize a nation, both with the advancement of the gospel and the application of Christian principles and the law of God to bring about civil justice according to God's principles.
Well, and it should embolden the church to act, right? I use the example of David when he cuts off Goliath's head, right? Then what do the Israelites do finally? They go and they chase down the armies of the Philistines, and they plunder and they wreck and they spoil, and it's all of a sudden they have their confidence and their courage. Why? Because their new king, they don't even know, right? Their new king has conquered the perceived threat.
Are you saying crush your enemies? Is that what you're saying?
Well, actually, almost. So one thing that I think would be interesting, maybe for another episode to talk about then is what does that look like as we continue to engage? Obviously, our first hope is that the nations will repent, that the individual people will hear the gospel and turn to Christ. But we also recognize that there is going to be antagonism in a world of sin. Obviously, the problem of trying to interact with Islam is going to be a growing issue. As we look at that, in sort of the way to go forward is to remember that there's nothing wrong with the civil government enforcing both tables of the law. Right? In a Christian nation...
There's everything right about that.
Right, exactly. In fact, it's inconsistent if you don't. That's right. In a Christian nation, what the government shouldn't be doing is telling me how, like, which confession I have to subscribe to. They shouldn't be necessarily prescribing my core doctrines. However, if we are a Christian Trinitarian nation, absolutely, they are obligated to reduce, to forbid, if you will, the high places of worship, the demon sacrifices, all of the pagan temples. And the reason why I bring that up is, as we go to the other nations, the idea is not to make them look like America. The idea is to bring the gospel to bear on it, to see the high places of demon worship torn down, and then they build their own Christian nation that is a reflective picture of their redeemed glory as a people saved by Christ. And so there is actually a proper place for the nation, if you will, civilly, to prop up the worship of the one true God, to support the efforts of the church, not as an authority over, not as a weakling underneath the authority of the church in some sort of inverted, two-kingdom philosophy, but rather as a support and an aid prophetically instructed by the church. And as we act upon that, that's where I think we have influence. And so then the question, and this is why I say a future episode, is what does that look like?
Are you sure?
I mean, do you want to spend a couple hours talking about the Crusades and why they might be validated and why we should have another one?
Well, yeah, that'd be
I didn't say that out loud, but I just did. Okay, I just said it out loud. Okay,
we're still recording.
Yeah. Anyway, no. What does the proper context of taking back Mecca look like? Obviously, by the gospel, but what is the place of a nation? Because really, if you think about most of the foreign wars that we've been involved in, right, they have been over ultimately, yes, okay, oil, resources, there's lots of stuff going on there, but they're religious wars too. We're dealing with Islam, right? So what does that look like in the future? What is the civil responsibility in those instances to bear arms against an imminent threat? And what does actually just war look like in the context of a Christian nation with dealing with non-Christian nations? I think that's an important topic that we need to deal with at some point.
But that's all the time that we have for Truth Today. We want to thank you for joining us. And until next time, we hope that you will grow in your love and commitment to Christ and His church as we are sanctified in the truth. God's word is truth.